Teaching English in Indigenous Communities in Quebec by Letitia, Heather, Draco, and Simon.
Quebec's microcosm. Other than Mexico, it is the only other province, territory, or state in North America whose official language is not English or bilingual. Yet the province has a diverse population, ranging from the First Nations people, the English and French settlers, to our modern-day influx of peoples from war-torn or oppressed regions. It is also a major economic and political bloc. However, to function within North American economy, its people need to be able to communicate with the community at large. Thus, English as a second language is often taught in elementary and secondary schools, as English has become the de facto lingua franca in the areas of economics, research, and business. The first part of this presentation will look at a broad context of ESL within Quebec and its educators, particularly the pull between cultural identity and teaching ESL in Quebec. As the presentation progresses, we will shift to examine English taught within Indigenous communities. Catru's 1985 seminal work on world Englishes categorized English-speaking world into three circles. The first, inner circle, consists of countries where English is the native language, such as US, Canada, UK, and Australia. Outer are regions or countries where English serves as a second language in multilingual society. India, Singapore, South Africa, and we can even consider Quebec. Expanding are regions or countries where English is spoken as a foreign language, but not for an institutional purpose. That being Russia, Germany, and Switzerland. These are all countries that would use English to communicate with the outside world, particularly in the areas of politics, business, and economics. What we're going to look at in the next slide is Quebec's unique position of being an outer within an inner circle nation. That is, within Canadian English Canada at large. Note that the Indigenous communities would also fall into this similar category, and we will discuss that later. Social political context of English in Quebec. Multicultural versus intercultural position. Quebec's preference of interculturalism is about building a dialogue within a majority culture and provide a means to integrate the other culture without harming too much the fabric of the Francophone community, thus maintaining a distinct society. An estimated 80% of ESL teachers are non-native English speakers. That is, they are either Francophone or they are allophone. That is, those whose mother tongue are neither English nor French. Quebec nationalism influences the political aspect of the social and cultural identities of both students and teachers. Le Conseil supérieur de la langue française is a call to defend the language integrity of Quebec. That is, overseeing that French is maintained as a dominant language used. However, ESL teachers are then in a difficult position to promote the English language and at the same time feel the need to defend their own cultural identity. This is specifically to those ESL teachers who are non-native English speakers. Thus, they have a difficult time with students uneased towards English immersion programs. Square-headed frogs. These are Francophones or allophones who have chosen to teach ESL within the province of Quebec. There is an advantage in having an accent. Without one, it might be too great a sacrifice. As mentioned before, students are often uneasy with individuals that don't have an accent as they feel there is a cultural tension. Thus, there is a preference for schools to hire francophones. Yet, these teachers as well feel the pressure in teaching English because they don't want the appearance of giving up their majority stance. There is also this idea of the native speaker fallacy. That is, native speakers of the language are the best ones that can teach the language. Phillipson showed this not to be the case. Now, what about other identities such as indigenous communities within the province? Do they also have these tensions? Clearly, they must. And are we just looking at the struggle between the majority and the minority depending on the perspective? Do Québécois have the sole claim to this issue? This is what we're going to delve into in the coming slides.
As we can see, teaching English in the Quebec context with its many cultures is a unique situation. One culture in particular that faces significant struggles is the Aboriginal community. A major issue surrounding Aboriginal education in Quebec is the lack of support Aboriginal students receive at school. A study done by Whitley in 2014 that focuses specifically on the support system Aboriginal students are receiving highlights many of the reasons why so many young Aboriginals face these significant struggles. According to Whitley, Aboriginal students deal with lower levels of school persistence, lower graduation rates, and lower enrollment numbers in post-secondary education compared to non-Aboriginal students. This discrepancy is large enough to have attracted much research on the subject. In Whitley's article, she looks at the specific interactions between school administration, teachers, curriculum, including the requirement of students to learn English, and Aboriginal students, to find reasons for this discrepancy. Aboriginal student success, like many non-Aboriginal student success, depends on the following: expectations of students from school and teachers, a relevant curriculum, views teachers hold of students, interactions of students with staff, teachers, and peers, attendance, and accessibility. The difference is that Aboriginal students face a difference in expectations from teachers and staff compared to non-Aboriginal students. The curriculum is much more irrelevant for them compared to non-Aboriginal students. For example, many students complain about the requirement to learn in English. Their culture and home life may not be as conducive to the structure of the school system, which limits their accessibility and attendance. The system was not designed with their culture in mind. All that being said, we see that Aboriginal students' educational needs are still not being met. We also see how much of a student's success depends on the teacher's views in general, and the teacher's expectations of the student. We see what aspects of education we as teachers need to focus on for a more inclusive classroom. Policies can only take us so far. The first step is listening, like Whitley did in her study. Next, we as teachers need to educate others and focus on finding support for those who need it. Whitley also highlights the dark past of Aboriginal students in Quebec and Canada as reasons for the continuous struggle they face with the educational system, stating, "Given the intergenerational effects of the residential school system, where Aboriginal students were stripped of their language, cultures, and communities, many families may continue to fear an agenda of assimilation for their children and view educational institutions as perpetuating colonization, making the development of collaborative relationships with teachers and administrators even more challenging." Now Letitia will take a look at the history of indigenous education in Quebec.
In this image, we see children lined up at the board carrying out a task. However, was this the intention or goal of indigenous education? What people didn't understand is that those boarding school terrorists thought that it could disappear in a generation, and they would have white-thinking children. They couldn't erase it, and therein lies the hope. Even though the missionaries tried, the boarding schools tried, all the well-intentioned little white people tried, but something hasn't died. This quote represents the reawakening of the spirit of indigenous men and women who survived the aftermath of residential schools and have re-embraced their culture, identity, and language. The relationship between language, culture, and identity. According to Partridge, cultural values and beliefs should transcend time and contribute to the uniqueness of a people. It should be viewed as a living dynamic composed of all the social institutions that ensure the transference of beliefs, values, language, and traditions. Culture, identity, and language are a critical part of our education system. We know this holds true for language in Quebec, as political efforts have clearly sought to ensure the preservation of French language over time. Similarly, throughout history, English was and continues to be a global language, calling into question whether or not ESL today takes on the form of the linguistic imperialism of the past. In order to avoid repeating history, it is important for us as teachers to understand our own biases and political views as it pertains to teaching ESL. Moreover, we should be mindful of and sensitive to how we go about assimilating quote-unquote L2 learners into the target culture and language. Aboriginal education. As Heather mentioned, the education system was not designed with Indigenous culture in mind. So let us quickly explore how the Aboriginal Indigenous learning system operated prior to colonization. The inception of the Aboriginal worldview emerged from their interactions with the physical environment. This view supported a culture represented concretely or symbolically through their understanding of and interaction with nature through the senses. This was conveyed through arts, oral traditions, medicines, etc. Canada's worldview at the time did not support this, as seen in this quote by Huntley. Aboriginal pedagogy, our own worldview and teaching, served the needs of Aboriginal peoples for thousands of years before the arrival of a new and dominant pedagogy. By Aboriginal standards, they had a quote-unquote place in the world. However, by government standards, the Indigenous peoples had to fit into the fabric of Western ideals and culture. This remains a bone of contention today. Similarly, L2 learners are not to be taught to conform to L2 and forsake their L1 values, but rather gain a plurilingual advantage to function in society. The history of residential schools. Language and culture are intricately intertwined. Therefore, if you do not know the language, can you really understand the subtleties, nuances, and deeper meanings of culture? Furthermore, if the language dies, does the culture die too? The answer to this is evident as seen through the impact of residential schools. According to Larson and Freeman, learning a language is a political act. Thus, it is not surprising that the federal government commissioned the schooling of Aboriginal children in 1879 to Christianize and civilize them. The goal of residential schools was institutionalized assimilation by stripping Aboriginal peoples of their language, culture, and connection with family. Once the family unit was broken, the generational traditions, beliefs, language, and cultural values that would be passed down came to a halt. The impacts of residential schools. One of the most alarming statistics was that the odds of Aboriginal children dying in a residential school were the same as that of a Canadian soldier serving in World War II. Children as young as 3 or 4 were physically removed from their homes and coerced to attend residential schools great distances away from their homes. There was also the assumption that all Aboriginal children were the same. Therefore, when some children were placed with others, they could not understand each other. Imagine how the isolation from their families traumatized them, and how disenfranchised they felt. At that, those who survived the residential schools did not fit into their own communities, nor Euro-Canadian communities. Generations still feel the repercussions of their parents' and grandparents' experiences in residential schools. Many suffered isolation, abuse of all forms, starvation, violation, and disease. They were punished for speaking their language and practicing traditional and spiritual beliefs. Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Today, the Government of Canada has sought to make amends through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which strives to address the needs of the survivors of residential schools and have dialogues about the events that took place in residential schools. How can we as ESL teachers best teach ESL in the Quebec context? By equipping L2 learners with the resources necessary to navigate through our complex world without the imposition of an hegemonic influence that may make the L2 learning experience antagonistic. Now we will segue into Simon's segment of the effects of second language teaching on Indigenous students' self-esteem.
There's been a lot of research in how ESL instruction affects minority speakers' view of themselves. But the majority of this has been done within Hispanic communities inside cities of the United States. But in 1995, Taylor and White went to did a study in northern Quebec in an Inuit community where they had Inuit kindergarteners look at a series of photos of Inuit and white adults and ask them to indicate which photos they associated with a series of positive and negative adjectives. Things like, who do you think is smarter, or who do you think has more friends? The students who received English language instruction in their kindergarten class were significantly more likely to ascribe negative traits to the Inuit people and the positive traits to the white people than the students who received their kindergarten classes in Inuktitut. Taylor and White concluded that this is a result of a low collective self-esteem among those students. The collective self-esteem is your self-esteem, the way you view your group, the group into which you belong to. This is very important because self-esteem and student success are very heavily correlated. First, using children's heritage language in school has a positive impact. First, using children's heritage language in school has a positive impact on their subsequent. While teaching English has been shown to lower the self-esteem of minority speakers, it remains an important skill in the global economy. The question is not, do you teach ESL in indigenous communities? It becomes, how do you teach ESL in a way that bolsters their sense of self-worth, as opposed to diminishing it? Last year, I had the opportunity to teach in the northern village of Inukjuak. I'm going to share some of the things that I learned while teaching there, hoping that it can be relevant to you. It is important to acknowledge the complexity of your role as a teacher. You are put in a position of power in a place with a long colonial history. If you do not acknowledge that, you are more likely to cause harm. A good way to show the value of indigenous culture is to incorporate it into the lesson plan. For example, I made my final project for my English class, having the students make a to-do book, a how-to book, describing how to build either a traditional tool or a traditional piece of clothing. Another way, another way that you can show that you value your students' culture is to learn some of the students' language. Even just a few words will go a long way. At the start of every day, I would have the students teach me a new Inuktitut word. This was also an opportunity to model good practices for second language learning. We hope this presentation was helpful and informative to you. Have a good day.